أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. خلال الحملة الانتخابية وأدى المرشح دونالد ترامب أنصاره بأنه سيجري تغييرات جذرية في الحكومة وسيعود من الهدر والاحتيال وسوء الاستخدام وسيدمر ما أسمه الدولة العميقة. لقد أحب الناخبون ذلك، حتى لو أعتقد القليل منهم أن التغيير سيأتي بسرعة أو بشكل كامل. لكن التغيير جاء بشكل أسرع مما توقعه كثير من الناس. ففي الشهر الأول له فقط في المكتب البيضاوي انتهج الرئيس دونالد ترامب من خلال إيلون ماسك أغنى رجل في العالم سياسة التغيير الجذري في البيروقراطية الفيدرالية، حيث قام بطرد الموظفين ووضع المؤيدين المخلصين له في مناصب رئيسية، وقام بتفكيك الوكالات الحكومية بشكل أسرع مما يتخيله أي شخص. ما هي خطة الرئيس؟ وهل معظم الأمريكيين معجبون بما يرونه؟ لمناقشة سياسات حملة الرئيس ترامب من أجل التغيير الجذري للحكومة، يسعدني أن أرحب باللجنة من الصحفيين السياسيين ميني راكر وكيسي هاربر. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Donald Trump was elected to do lots of things. One of them was to root out what he called the deep state and change the way Washington works, or, as advocates will argue, the way it doesn't work. We're going to take a look at the early decisions to change the way of Washington. I'm delighted to have Minnie Racker and Casey Harper joining us for the first time here on Dakhel, Washington. Thank you both for joining me this morning. So, in his earliest days, the new president issued a number of executive orders that have had a huge impact on the way government functions. Could you tell us about some of these, Casey?
Absolutely. I think President Trump has kicked off a three-part war, really, on the establishment in Washington. First part of that is taking on some of the traditional Republican policies that are very familiar to us in DC. He's cracking down on the border, a Republican favorite. He's opening up domestic oil production, something Republicans are always after. And he is beefing up national security and the military. These are no strangers to traditional Republican politics. The second part of his war is a little more controversial, a little more Trumpian, and that is the culture war, what we call the culture war, where these are the social issues, the more personal issues. They may involve religion or personal beliefs. And Trump has taken a hard stance where some politicians want to avoid taking a stance. So, for instance, he's taken on the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda, which is some of the more controversial racial policies that have become pervasive in the federal government and even in private corporations. He's issued executive orders to defund them, to fire all employees who work on race related issues in the federal government. And then at the same time, he's taken on the transgender issue. So he is forbid essentially transgender individuals from joining the military. He's cutting funding from that as well. And then the third part is just simply across the board cuts. That's the third part of his agenda, which with of course Elon Musk helping lead the way, cutting federal spending in every way. So the traditional Republican issues, the culture war, and now draining the swamp, as they say here in DC, with Elon Musk.
All right, so Minnie, let's take a closer look at the third leg of what Casey just focused on, which is the effort to impose efficiency in government. Now, we've had some pretty draconian decisions in the early days, ending all federal grants, ending foreign aid. Why sort of suspend all these things from day one? What's the logic here?
Well, I think, it's very Elon Musk type logic. Trump has put Elon in charge of the so-called Department of Government Efficiency to do, what Elon has done best in the other companies he runs, which is just indiscriminate cuts, cut to the bone and see how little you actually need to run these programs. And I think the logic there makes sense to a businessman like Elon. It's worked for him. His companies are still running, but it's unclear if that's going to work in the federal government. So some of the specifics you mentioned, we've seen the government trying to cut basically all federal grant money, and that's already caused some effects with payments throughout the country to the states, to farmers, and we've seen that we've already had the legal system kind of pushing back on these plans and saying, no, you can't do that. This is not legal because it's had such far-reaching effects. But we still see the Trump administration pushing to do that. You also mentioned foreign aid. We've seen effects here. USAID hospitals and programs abroad already having to shut down and having real effects on people's lives. That's a negative consequence. The positive consequence, according to Trump and his allies, is that a lot of the spending there was unnecessary and wasteful, and it's going to be too hard to root out kind of individually in a targeted approach. So they're going to come back and see what they need later. In the meantime, that's probably going to have some bad consequences.
All right, so let's take a closer look at some of this. Casey, the Department of Government Efficiency, this isn't really a government department like Health and Human Services and the Department of Defense, is it?
No, not quite. I mean, the Department of Defense, Health and Human Services have thousands of employees, large buildings near where I live in Washington, D.C. They have huge bureaucratic states. The Department of Government Efficiency, essentially, Elon took over part of the IT department, the part of the government that runs the computers and the internet. And he hired, I think most of them are not being paid, but he got a handful of very smart young men, some of whom have been kind of controversial in the media, and they are just going line by line through these government programs. And so it's very unconventional, very unusual for DC, but this is the approach he's taken. It's not a traditional government program. Usually Congress has to create those programs if it was really going to have significant funding, because in the US, Congress controls the money. The president has a lot of power, but ultimately Congress controls the money. But the Department of Government Efficiency doesn't spend money, it cuts it. And so it's an interesting loophole that he doesn't really need money to run this department, and therefore whether he really needs congressional approval so far has not been a problem.
So you just opened up a fascinating constitutional issue, which is who controls the money. Now, in the last month, a new term has entered our political lexicon, the word impoundment. It sounds very medieval or old English, but it's a term that people are now throwing around to discuss the issue of who controls the spending of money that is authorized and approved by Congress. Can the president not spend money that Congress says should be spent? Mitty, what's the legal situation here?
I think we're going to have to see this one play out in the courts. There's a lot of debate about this right now. I don't think you're going to see too much pushback from Trump's allies in Congress. They're pretty much on board with the president, with some slight minor critiques of his actions that they're worried are going to have effects in their district. But on the whole, Trump has the power here. Trump has the support of voters, and I think most congressional Republicans are along for the ride. Like I said before, I think most of the debate is going to happen in the courts. I think there are, plenty of federal laws suggesting much of this spending should be controlled by Congress. But you have the administration pushing back and saying, hey, it's my government. I should have control here, basically. And those questions are going to come up before judges. They're already coming up. and we're going to have to see what those judges decide. I think those are going to be kind of the last real check on Donald Trump. And then after that, there's the question of how much the administration is going to abide by those rulings. You've seen Vice President J.D. Vance kind of suggest that the administration should not have to abide by these rulings. Meanwhile, you've had Trump say he will always abide by the courts and appeal when needed.
And Casey, what do you think about that issue in terms of the MAGA agenda and the courts? I mean, it's one thing to make a case, certainly legitimate, one way or the other, to appeal a judge's decision. It's tough to imagine a president of the United States not obeying ultimately the final decision of a court.
It is, and I think this is sort of a red herring, a distraction created by many in the liberal media today. Because in the liberal media, Trump is the specter of Nazi Germany, no matter what he does. And so anytime he even has the opportunity to somehow shred the Constitution, they assume that he's laying awake at night, just giggling at the idea. But I mean, the president himself appeared for his own personal criminal court hearings all throughout the campaign. He's always shown respect for the courts. You know, he himself was prosecuted. If there was ever a time he was going to defy the law, raise up some kind of resistance, it's when he himself was led into a courtroom. He's never done that. The comments that many referred about J.D. Vance, the Vice President J.D. Vance certainly was critical of the rulings, but you know, Democrats and Republicans are highly critical of rulings all the time. They still obey the court rulings. Many Democrats in the U.S. right now have said the U.S. Supreme Court itself is illegitimate. They questioned 20 years ago when the Supreme Court, chose, President George W. Bush. So both sides have often been critical of court rulings. I think, I'll be embarrassed later maybe, but I think we're in no danger of defying these court rulings. But to the earlier point, there is a large constitutional question about what exactly the president and the executive branch has to do, because both, this is not just a Trump problem. In the previous administration, President Joe Biden significantly stretched the limits of executive authority, even when it comes to spending money. Biden tried to essentially just forgive hundreds of billions of dollars of student debt that was not appropriated by Congress, and the Supreme Court shut that down. We've seen Democratic mayors in large cities in the U.S. say they're simply not going to enforce or help enforce immigration laws. And so these executive figures on both the right and the left are pushing the boundaries right now of what laws they have to obey. And it is culminating in a potential constitutional crisis in this Trump presidency.
So if we got one eye on the courts, I'm sure politicians, being politicians, have at least one eye on the polls. Minnie, how popular is the president's effort to slash and burn government spending?
I'll say it's fairly popular, but I want to add some nuance to that. The latest polls we've seen, Trump's approval rating still high. He's doing exactly what he said he was going to do. I think there's a lot of animosity towards the government bureaucrats here in Washington, and people out in America, they're ready to see Trump do what he's doing now. They're excited about a smaller government. They're excited about more efficiency and saving money and all that kind of thing. So I think Trump so far has, he pretty much has a mandate to do some of these things. And you see that also in the way, like I said, his Republican allies in Congress basically are going along with this with no real pushback to anything he's doing. They know that he has support right now from the American people for these kinds of programs. I will say the polling so far also shows a little bit of doubt about how involved Elon should be in the government, which I think suggests that, people may have some questions about these cuts. I think you're also seeing that Trump, 3 weeks ago started with a very high approval rating, and it's come down slightly. So that may suggest that there's some negative reaction to the things he's doing. And I think on the Democratic side, and in terms of like the Trump opposition in this country, it's going pretty crazy. They're not liking at all what they're seeing. You're seeing, I think something like 40 times more calls to Congress lately complaining about what Trump's doing, pushing Democrats to do more to push back. But right now they just really can't, because this is what the voters wanted.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to go deeper into this. We're going to look at some of the specifics of the president's slashing of spending, and as you just concluded there, Minnie, what Democrats are and aren't doing in response. In just a moment. Our guests this week include Casey Harper. Casey, who's joining us for the first time, is bureau chief at the Center Square. He co-hosts a weekly show, America in Focus, where he offers insight into Washington politics and policy. A former staffer in Congress, he also reported for The Hill. And joining us is Minnie Racker. Minnie covers national politics, campaigns, and culture. She's reported as a staff writer for the Daily Beast, Time Magazine, and National Journal. Casey, so far, the focus has been on, I'd say, a couple of government agencies that have attracted the most attention. The U.S. Agency of International Development, which gives foreign development aid, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was established not too long ago under Democratic administrations, ostensibly to help consumers dealing with financial fraud here in the United States. The president has, and Elon Musk, who I guess we're now all on a first name basis, although I've never met the gentleman, they've really gone after these two agencies. Why especially these two, do you think?
Well, I think this is just the beginning of a wholesale approach. I mean, I think USAID in particular has hit it. There's been an increasing frustration with foreign aid among Republicans in particular because of the outsized, very large level of Ukraine aid. The tens of billions of dollars that has been sent from the U.S. to Ukraine. A lot of Republicans are very concerned that that money has been misused. It should not have been sent, whatever it may be. And so, because of that issue, there's a lot of scrutiny on foreign aid in general and real questioning of why this foreign aid should be sent at all. And USAID, as it's named, aid is the agency for that aid. So it was one of the first to come into to the spotlight because I think of the scrutiny of Ukrainian aid. And then, I don't know how motivated Musk is by getting media attention and media headlines. In some sense, he seems to defy the media and not care. And other times, he seems to play them very well. But USAID has plenty of headlines, can make plenty of headlines. For instance, spending on transgender operas in foreign countries, or these very flashy things that most Americans would not support, that can really help, I think, drive the animus and drive this entire movement of cutting spending. Because for the next, few months, Musk can keep reminding us of, hey, remember when we paid $2 million for this opera in Venezuela? This is the kind of thing that's going on, and this is why I need to be doing what I'm doing. So it's giving him fuel for that cutting of waste fire.
So far, I mean, it's one thing to go after foreign aid, never a hugely popular issue in American politics. Minnie, do you expect things will heat up if indeed the Department of Government Efficiency begins to go after Social Security, Medicaid, things that really touch millions of American citizens?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I agree with Casey that this was kind of an easy target to start with. It really fits with the America First policy vision that I think a lot of Americans support. But if you start touching, the government services that people depend on, that I think is going to be hugely unpopular. And I think, you're already starting to see this in some of the places where these cuts have real effect on people's lives. For instance, I mentioned there's certain grants to American farmers that are paused, that are giving farmers, real questions about their livelihoods and the things that they had agreed to with the government. You also see the funding, the health research funding that is being slashed right now, and that could limit our research into diseases at universities, and that could have a real effect on people's lives. And again, that's not, I think, as egregious as things like Social Security, things that would, I think, get a huge pushback. But you are starting to see some Republican politicians make little comments about funding like that into technology and research in their districts, things that will affect real people's lives. And so I think, it's only going to get more difficult for Trump and Elon from here. And so, like Casey said, having these kinds of easy targets to look back on, these easy wins for Elon and Trump, I think they're going to kind of count on that for fuel through some of the more thorny issues.
And Casey, what do you think? Do you expect Elon Musk to eventually make his way to these more core functions of government, like Social Security and Medicaid, or is he going to stick more or less to the dubiously unpopular projects like foreign aid?
That's a question I think we won't have to answer for a couple months, but it really is the question because there are essentially four untouchable areas of federal spending in the U.S. National defense, Medicare, which is healthcare for older people, Medicaid, which is healthcare for the poor, and then Social Security, which is just basically providing living expenses for the elderly. These programs, though, are untouchable, but they're huge. You cannot address America's federal debt problem without addressing these problems. So uh, I think that he can trim a little bit. He can reduce some inefficiencies, but Trump himself has made very clear he does not going to touch these programs. It would be shocking if he did. It could be something that someone like Trump's heir, J.D. Vance, if he runs for re-election, and I think he should, he's one of the most powerful person in Republican politics who can run for president after Trump. It's something that he could take on as a big issue. But Musk single-handedly cannot touch these without the express blessing of President Trump because these are such protected programs in U.S. politics, both Republicans and Democrats. And that's actually why we are in the debt problem we have. $37 trillion in debt is because neither party is willing to even talk about touching these programs.
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody would argue that there's zero waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon or in Social Security or any of these programs. But actually, trying to use a scalpel to get after them is a very politically sensitive process.
I think as time goes on and as people begin to see the effects of these policies, either Trump will be proven right, they're going to be, things that make the government more efficient and make America better for Americans, or they're going to lead to real problems in our systems, rising costs.
And Casey, we'll have a few seconds left. When push comes to shove, will Republicans on Capitol Hill want to preserve their prerogatives as the legislative branch in control of spending, or will they want to be loyal Trump supporters and defer to the president on controlling spending plans?
At least these first few months, they're going to defer to Trump and be loyal to him, especially the House of Representatives. The Senate has a little bit more of a backbone and might stand up to him. But right now, it's all Trump all the time in D.C.
All Trump, all the time. All right, Casey Harper, Minnie Racker, thank you very much for helping explain the first few weeks of cutting spending in Trump 47. Thanks for joining me on Dakhel, Washington. إلى هنا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول الدور الذي يلعبه إيلون ماسك في إدارة ترامب، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. أن نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل. شكرا وإلى اللقاء.